Welcome to Administer Identity module. In this session, we will delve into essentials of Microsoft Entra ID, focusing on understanding its core concepts, creating and configuring identities, and managing these identities effectively. We'll start by exploring what Microsoft Entra ID is and how it functions within an organization. These include examining its features and comparing it to Active Directory domain services. Then we'll learn how to create, configure, and manage identities within Microsoft Entra ID. By the end of this module, you'll have a comprehensive understanding of Microsoft Entra ID, including its P1, P2 plans, and the abilities to implement self-service password resets. Additionally, you'll gain experience in managing Azure identities and governance, specifically focusing on users, groups, and licenses within Microsoft Entra ID. Let's get started on this exciting journey to mastering Microsoft Entra ID. Microsoft Entra ID is a cloud-based identity and access management service designed to help organizations manage and secure access to resources. Let's try to understand some more about this using an example of a Contoso organization. Let's consider Contoso is an on-prem environment at the moment. And the current setup that they have is they're using on-prem Active Directory. Now, typically an Active Directory would be configured by using a server on-prem. So somebody would have to go and install a server. On that server, they'll have to configure an operating system, ideally a server-based operating system. So let's take an example of a Windows server. And on top of that, they'll have to enable some features for directory services like Active Directory. Now, this is what will provide you managing of your access of users and devices. Now, part of this, you'll need some sort of authentication and authorization protocols. Things like NTLM, Kerberos, LDAP, and your Active Directory is a hierarchical structure, and typically to manage some of that, you would use organizational units on your setup. To add governance, you will look at introducing group policy objects. Now, let's consider we have an admin in Contoso called Alice. Now, Alice the admin is looking to migrate some of their on-prem environment into the cloud. For them to achieve this, one of the first things they would need is an account created in the cloud. They might already have an account if they're already using services like M365. However, if they don't, they'll simply create an account and provide some details. This will include your organizational details. And as part of that, you would need to register a domain. Now, this is something that you typically choose as part of your ongoing setup in your environment. A lot of the organizations will typically pick their company name as part of the domain. For example, let's assume Alice decides to choose the domain setting as Contoso, given that somebody hasn't already taken or registered Contoso before. It's a unique address. Now, once you'd register this is what we suggest setting up a tenant in an environment. Now, a tenant is nothing more than simply creating a representation of your organization into the cloud. Now, once you register your domain, as a setup, automatically Microsoft creates in the backend for you is a Microsoft Entra service that's already configured and running for you. You don't necessarily need to do similar to what we do on-prem environments, like creating a server, configuring an operating system, and enabling Active Directory onto it. We don't have to do that at all. In the cloud, when you configure your account setup, you automatically have a running service available to you, which in this case will be your identity service as Microsoft Entra ID. Now, as a result of that, since Alice in this setup was creating the account and providing account details, Alice becomes the first user on the setup. And as being the first user, Alice also gets the highest level of access provided to this in this environment. Typically, we discuss this as roles available in Entra ID, and Alice gets a global admin role or global administrator role, which gives Alice the highest level of access to manage the entire Entra ID. Now, as part of this setup, if now Alice is considering managing some of the resources that are on-prem, then first of all, we need to understand that we do not require some of the protocols that are used on-prem environment. Things like the authentication protocols mentioned before, like NTLM, Kerberos, or LDAP. Entra is a cloud-based service, so it requires cloud-based authentication protocols. Some of the modern authentication protocols that we use for Entra would be OAuth for authorization. Now we could add OpenID Connect to this. Along with that, we can use things like SAML and WS Federation. As these are web-based authentication protocols, you require HTTPS as part of that process. Now, you do not require some of the authentication protocols that are used on-prem, so for protocols like NTLM, Kerberos, and LDAP are no longer required in the cloud. However, if there's a need for any of these protocols to be used for legacy applications, you can make them available in the cloud or on Entra. Now, let's go back to the scenario where currently Alice has an on-prem environment and Alice is looking to move into the cloud. So far, Alice has created a tenant in the cloud with some details of Contoso, and Alice has become the first user on that environment. Now, for the existing resources that Alice has, things like users and devices, Alice does not necessarily need to recreate them all again in the cloud. For this service, we can use a resource called Entra ID Connect, which can help migrate existing users into the cloud environment and sync them into the cloud. Let's take an example. For instance, I have a user that sits on-prem and call this user 1. Now, user 1 is an on-prem user. After Alice uses Entra ID Connect and syncs all these users into the cloud, this user will appear in the cloud and is able to now access resources that are cloud-based as well. So user 1 is in a hybrid state. Let's, for example, assume user 1 goes and logs into a device, authenticates themselves onto the device. This authentication could be done by their Active Directory on their prem environment. After authenticating and logging into the device, they simply go and open a link. Let's assume in this case, we're going onto office.com. As soon as they type in office.com, this service is cloud-based. So this will automatically redirect this traffic to Entra to ask Entra for authentication. Now, Entra is going to authenticate this user, given that it understands this user exists. If Alice has synced these users from on-prem to the cloud using Entra ID Connect, then this user would be available for Entra to understand either in the cloud or, depending on the authentication methods used in Entra Connect, maybe an on-prem authentication at that point would be required. Once Entra is able to authenticate this user, Entra will simply signal back to the user to authenticate and allow them access to their portal. This is a user that's in a hybrid state. Now, there are certain settings that you might require to configure as part of your Entra ID Connect, which might need to sync backwards. Now, typically, these are connected in one direction. For example, let's assume we have a user that we create in the cloud. So this time, we create a user that is user 2. Now, user 2 is a cloud user created in Entra environment. As a user 2 is created, the user 2 does not automatically get created on my Active Directory environment. There's no such connection in my setup at the moment. Now, typically, we don't create a setup like that using Entra Connect. However, there are certain settings that we might need to enable, and these are important settings that we can configure as part of my configuration along with my Entra Connect. Now, these features, we refer to them as write-back options. Typically, you'll enable write back for passwords or device details and settings. Now, as a quick example on this, as soon as my user 1 logs into office.com and is authenticated by Entra in the cloud, this user goes onto the office.com setting page and resets their password. Now, if I did not have a write back feature enabled, this password reset will happen and be maintained within the cloud environment. However, on their on-prem environment, this user will still have their old password. So this user is now managing 2 different passwords. However, if I enable the password write back feature, this new password change is then synced down onto the Active Directory environment as well, and they don't need to manage 2 passwords. Now, let's switch onto some details onto the slides very quickly. So, just to cover these concepts in a bit more detail, an identity is an object that can authenticate. An account is simply data that's associated to that identity. And a Microsoft Entra account is an account that's created within Microsoft Entra ID or other Microsoft Cloud services. As we mentioned earlier, a tenant is nothing more than simply representing an organization into the cloud environment and bringing in the details of the organization as we did for Contoso. Now, we'll talk a little bit more about subscriptions, which we'll need to create resources into the cloud environment a bit later in the next module. As part of your Entra ID, you have loads of different features. Now, these features come along with different plans. If you already have a Microsoft Cloud account, you might already be working with a free Entra plan. However, the free plans come with limited features, such as already offers single sign-on, cater up to 500,000 objects, multi-factor authentication. However, they're limited with some of the features. If you're looking to enable certain other features as part of your plans, you might be looking into upgrading your plan from free version to a premium P1 or premium P2. If you're looking to manage privileged identity management and identity governance, then you might even need to look into Entra Suite. Now, this is a very quick overview of how some of the features may look like. However, let's jump onto a quick link to look at some of these in a bit more detail. Right, if we open a browser and type in Entra licenses, we can look at one of the first links that's popped up, which is Microsoft.com link, and talks about Entra plans and prices. Now, if we have a quick look at that, as compared to what we had on the slide, you would see different plans available for you to look at, such as P1, P2, and your Entra Suite. Now, within this, you have quite a few different features available to explore, more than what we had on the slides. So you can click on Expand All and have a look at some more details into the features that are available. Now, feel free to compare some of these features depending on your needs that you have in your own organization in terms of what you are going to be implementing and utilizing as part of your Entra. And if, for example, you need to look at the free options, now, like I mentioned earlier on, you can find some of these details right at the bottom of the page. If you are considering to rely just onto the free version, you can still see some details right over here. As mentioned before, if you already have an account on some of the cloud services, you might already be working within a free plan. As you can see, I've landed onto the portal and I've used portal.azure.com to get to Azure Portal. Now, within Azure Portal, I have my Entra service available for me to access from here. Now, if I click onto my Entra environment, I can see as a quick overview for my Entra, I have a company name called Contoso that is registered. However, unlike my demo explanation earlier on, my primary domain isn't Contoso. That is simply because Contoso name was already taken. Now, if you have a domain name that's not taken, you can register that, which means your company name and your primary domain could look exactly the same. Now, I'm currently using a P2 license to use all different features to work with my demos in this course. If I look at the blades, you can see I have other features such as users and groups, which we'll cover shortly. Now, before we jump onto some of those, we are going to talk about a particular feature that's very important if you are considering lessening the load on your administrators to reset passwords. I'm referring to a feature called self-service password reset, or in short, sometimes also referred as SSPR. Now, this feature comes under 3 different statuses. You can keep this feature as none, which means not enabling it for anybody. You can switch it to all, which means enabling it for everybody in your organization, or you can keep it under selected, where I have currently left my setting. Now, once you do select it, you can choose a group from your environment for a group of users that can reset their passwords. Now, for you to be able to manage that, one thing that's important to understand that you're only allowed to choose one group. For instance, if I come in here and start thinking that I have a set of users in IT group that I also want to add to this list, when I do this, it replaces my existing group. So you can only use one group at a time when you're configuring SSPR. So I'll switch back to a specific group that I've created called SSPR users. You don't necessarily have to name it that way, but for ease of use, I've called it SSPR users. Now, bear in mind, group nesting is allowed. Now, one might think, how is this more secure? I am allowing users to reset their passwords. A malicious actor could do the same. They could go and reset someone's account password and gain access to it. Well, there are some other things that we'll add into this to ensure that no one can reset someone else's password. And for this part, we'll look into the process of configuring SSPR. As the users are onboarded onto SSPR, they'll be required to use authentication methods. They are typically asked to register 1 or 2 different authentication methods that they can use to authenticate themselves to reset their password. Typically, if I look at my authentication method list, I have quite a few different options that I can pick from. Things like adding a authenticator app and request a one-time passcode or generate a code from the authenticator app, and use other options that are listed on the screen for authentication methods. However, if I take a step back and look at my self-service password reset methods, you can see there are options for you to look at secret questions. Now, secret questions can be used to register as part of your authentication methods for SSPR only. You can ask your user to register anywhere between 3, 4, or 5 different questions, and you can ask or challenge them to respond to out of the registered number of questions. For example, if we are looking at 5 registered questions, ask them to respond to 3, 4, or 5, or all of the above as part of their authentication method. Now, a lot of the time, security administrators might not consider this particular method very secure, simply because when you're configuring this setting, there are a set of predefined questions that Microsoft offers. There's a list of 20 different questions that you can pick from. A lot of these questions could be something that people can look into by doing social engineering. So they can find out information about users on different social media sites. Things like, what's your favorite food? Which company did you work for? What's your favorite car? What kind of city do you like traveling to? So similar other questions that might be easier for people to guess by looking at or trolling you onto social media sites. However, to make this even better, Microsoft offers you to create custom questions that you can then devise, ensuring that these type of questions are not going to be easily found on social media sites if somebody was looking at trolling someone on those sites. Now, this is one way of registering your authentication methods, and other than this, you could decide not to choose security questions and use other authentication methods which you might consider a bit more secure, such as Authenticator app. Now, along with this, there's an important information that's in the bottom of the screen that you can see over here. This is quite important to understand on how you might require your admins to configure this setting slightly different. Now, as the message suggests, admins are always going to be asked to register 2 different options. Even if you're configuring one option for your users, your admins will always be required 2 different authentication methods, as it says on the screen. So please remember, if you're adding administrators as part of this feature, just make sure they'll need to be registering 2 different features on this. Now, one thing to add to this, if you go back into looking at your licensing for your Entra, this feature is available for all different licenses. Now, just to compare some of the details that we mentioned about the SSPR, as suggested, we have different options available. For example, free plan, we have a premium P1 plan, and we have P2 plan. Now, for particularly SSPR, this particular feature is spread differently in different licenses. For free version, you're only able to reset passwords for your online users, or in other words, cloud user accounts. And they can only reset their password if they know their existing password. For P2, P1 and Premium P2 licenses, this is where you can bring in users that are in a hybrid state or on cloud, and they can reset their password if they currently know their existing password, they have forgotten their password, or if the account was locked out. This brings us to the end of the first part of administering Entra ID. Now, see you into the next part where we discuss a little bit more into users and groups.